Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to episode 33 of This Week in FCPA for the week ending December 23, 2016, the holiday edition. In this episode, Jay Rosen and I discuss the Odebrecht and Braskem's FCPA enforcement action and also their implications in the global anti-corruption front as global anti-corruption enforcement settlement actions. We take a look at the Teva Pharmaceuticals FCPA enforcement action. All of these enforcement actions were announced, of course, this week. We look at the Goldman Sachs issues about being further ensnared in the 1MDB scandal. We take a look at the possible involvement of the president of Goldman in this transactions that Goldman did for 1MDB and its implications for due diligence on customers going forward. We talk about the Cowboys winning the NFC East and their number one seed in the NFC. Jay gives us a bit of a roundup on the Patriots, and I conclude with the Texans and their playoff hopes. The episode comes in at just over 35 minutes. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to This Week in FCPA and wish you a very Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Happy Holidays. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist. I'd like to welcome you to episode 33 of This Week in FCPA, the holiday edition. As always, I'm joined by and enjoy podcasting with Mr. Translations himself, Jay Rosen. Jay, welcome on this December 23rd.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to celebrate this holiday edition of This Week in FCPA with you. And we've got lots of great year-end settlements to talk about.
Well, Jay, I think it only appropriate that on the same week of the intersection of Christmas and Hanukkah, we have the intersection of two of the 4 or 5 largest FCPA fines in the history of the world ever, and indeed the largest anti-corruption global settlement in the history of the world ever. So obviously I'm speaking about Odebrecht / Braskem, and then actually, as a larger component of an FCPA fine, we have Teva Pharmaceuticals. So what are some of the numbers tell us on Odebrecht Braskem?
Well, we say this is where I need some clarification, but I guess there's a minimum fine of 2.6 billion, and it can go all the way up to 4 billion, and that is dependent upon the financial strength of Odebrecht. So they're going to make a determination at some point exactly where those numbers fall. The other thing that's interesting is it's a joint resolution between Brazil, Switzerland, and the United States, and I believe the United States will get 15% of the awards. So this is very interesting to see that a bulk of the awards will be going back into Brazil. And I read something today in the Wall Street Journal that Petrobras is already making a claim to want to get made whole for some of the bribery that happened to it based on Odebrecht and Braskem. The other numbers is that about $788 million were paid out as part of the scheme, and that was paid out by Odebrecht. Odebrecht, the nexus of it was that they had employees in Miami, Florida, who participated in it, and the way Braskem gets roped into this is they had ADRs trading here on U.S. exchanges. So those are the top numbers that I look at. Tom, do you have any insight into how they figure out that range?
So I think on the Odebrecht total number, it's about a little over 400 million paid to the U.S., somewhere in that range. And I think that brings us at, when it was announced, it was number 4 on the top 10 list of FCPA settlements, but that was Wednesday. On Thursday, Teva came in with 519 million, bumping it. So we have Teva at number 4, and we have Odebrecht at number 5 as of today. Of course, it could change next week. But on the numbers, yeah. So frankly, it was stunning to read the criminal information, which laid out the sentencing guidelines range, because it was high as $6 billion based upon the conduct of Odebrecht. We can only say the conduct was truly worldwide in scope, both institutionalized at the functional business unit level. There was essentially a bribery department, but also personally run by the company's CEO, who has now been sentenced to 19 years in jail in Brazil. So we had really a Siemens level bribery scheme for multiple years. And I think that when you have the senior level involvement, you have an established institutionalized bribery scheme, you have that's when you're going to have your highest fine and penalty. So the range was as high as $6 billion, but the company did receive, I believe, 20% credit based upon not self-disclosure, but their cooperation with the United States government and their remediation. Interestingly, on the remediation, even though they received credit for that, they did not. They are required to have a monitor which communicates. I think that the Department of Justice is either not satisfied with the rate of remediation or the quality of the remediation, or is concerned about the company fulfilling their obligations under the deferred prosecution going forward. So they do have a monitorship as well. But on the clearly, Odebrecht received a considerable settlement. But within the range you discussed, Jay, I have it between 4.5 billion down to 2.6 billion, and the Odebrecht claims an inability to pay more than the 2.6 billion. So there's going to be some additional information presented to the United States government, and a decision will be made by the end of March 2017. So the end of Q1, the company will know what its final fine and penalty will be. This is really not something we've seen before. We have seen companies receive substantive discounts when they did not have the ability to pay. What we have not seen is that be part of a open-ended or unended obligation, non-final obligation, I should say. That may be because this current administration wanted to close it out. It may be because Odebrecht wanted to close it out under the current administration. It could be a whole host of reasons. Perhaps they wanted the year in tax for tax reporting purposes. Nevertheless, very interesting to see that range. Also, a lengthy payout by Odebrecht. So we have seen annual or multiple payouts, large fines and penalties. I think that is a concession by all of the governments involved that they had no interest in putting this company out of business. So that's, I think, a very welcome development to not only have governments recognize it's really not in their interest to put companies out of business, but also for companies to give some greater incentive to come forward and, if not self-disclose, certainly cooperate. The breadth and scope of the bribery scheme was really stunning, Jay. If you read about it, it was across the globe, the multiple countries involved.
I got 11 countries, so it went all the way from Angola, Argentina, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, Peru, and not to be left out, certainly not last, but definitely, no, certainly but not least, but definitely last, Venezuela. So that's not necessarily all the usual suspects. There's some, there's a big concentration there in Latin America, and I guess the only usual suspects we see missing there are Russia, but we'll get to them when we talk about Teva.
Right. And so the company even bought a bank in Antigua so that they could funnel the bribes through without having to worry about such messy things as money laundering requirements and obligations. But it's, I think, a concession by the government that they need the regions, and when I say region, the Americas regions, largest Latin American construction company, to continue as an ongoing concern. They need that construction company expertise. The company needs to exist for the Brazilian economy, and people who are doing construction work shouldn't lose their jobs simply because they have corrupt management. So really interesting that multiple reasons for the structure of the settlement. And you really noted or highlighted, Jay, one of the other key components, which is the split of the pie. So we had the United States, we had Brazil, and we had Switzerland. And we have not seen Switzerland as a part of FCPA settlements before. This might be a very interesting signal that Switzerland is going to provide more cooperation for enforcement agencies on the money laundering angle of things going forward. And that certainly is going to make life difficult for corrupt persons, individuals, companies, and entities if the Swiss are going to start cooperating at a level where they have apparently cooperated in the Odebrecht case and to the point where they were receiving part of the fine and penalty. The other thing, Jay, is it brings home to me is what Dan Kahn and Carol Brockmeyer talked about at the ACI National FCPA Conference in early December in Washington, which is what they call the one pie theory, that you have one pie of fines and penalties, and that it needs to be equitably split up. And really, it's the United States, I think, that's going to take the lead in suggesting that split, because as the world's leading enforcer of bribery and corruption laws, the U.S., I think only the Department of Justice and SEC has the credibility, cachet, and really expertise to lead this type of effort. If you tie that into the relative short length of time it took for this settlement to be arrived at, certainly in the FCPA context, I think it was 18 months or so, although the investigation had been going on much longer in Brazil, so that the Department of Justice would have had a large amount of information to collect from their Brazilian counterparts, their prosecutorial counterparts. Nevertheless, Odebrecht, I think, by running basically to the U.S., acknowledged that only the U.S. could put together a global settlement. So that's significant for compliance going forward. In terms of the new administration, it really doesn't matter what the administration's view on anti-bribery, anti-corruption compliance enforcement is. If companies recognize that the U.S. Department of Justice is going to be key to having a global settlement, they're still going to self-disclose, cooperate, and move towards the types of conduct the government wants to see, which leads to a discount. And that may be the lasting legacy of Odebrecht.
So a couple of questions I have for you. One of them is, can you go back a little bit historically and talk about Anderson and Enron and why Odebrecht is structured in such a way to keep the company going? So that would be number one, and then I got another one to come back to you for.
Sure. Many commentators, many lawyers, many government regulators recall this story of Arthur Anderson, who went to trial against the government related to document destruction out of the Enron scandal, and sustained a guilty verdict, and the company dissolved. Now, at the end of the day, the guilty verdict was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, but that was some 2 or 3 years after the firm had ceased to exist. And I've talked to prosecutors who said they have no interest in putting companies out of business. They recognize that the subject matter expertise is not something you want to lose. You don't want to throw people out on the street simply because someone made a mistake or they have a corrupt management. And so that may be one of the reasons that deferred prosecution agreements were developed to help ameliorate that. And the Odebrecht resolution really points towards that exact reason, and it points towards the usefulness of the tool of a deferred prosecution agreement to punish a culpable and guilty entity while not penalizing the company so severely that it has to go out of business. So it was it's like a very strategic use of the deferred prosecution agreement, and particularly so given that it was not a U.S.-based company. Typically, the Department of Justice has less concern about putting a foreign company out of business than they would about a U.S. company, obviously because those folks don't vote in U.S. elections. So I thought it was a very useful and powerful example of what a DPA can bring to a prosecutor's quiver of arrows to use going forward. And indeed, if you flip it around, Odebrecht recognized that as well by going to the Department of Justice. The other thing you raised, Jay, was Petrobras. And Petrobras may have a claim back against Odebrecht. That is not part of the one pie. If Petrobras lost money, if they received less quality services, they have a direct claim against Odebrecht. And whatever Odebrecht's settlement is with the U.S. Department of Justice, that's probably not going to cover Petrobras. Now, the Brazilian government might work something out with Petrobras, as they're the owners of Petrobras. It's a state-owned enterprise. But that could be the subject of a separate civil action. So we'll just have to see how that plays out.
So thank you for going through that. One other question now. So I know Electrobras is still out there. Do you know of any other Brazilian entities that there would be either a tax benefit for them wrapping up in the next few days, or do you think some of those other parts are going to continue on into the new year and the new administration?
Well, it's given the size of these settlements and the scopes of what happened under these enforcement actions, it certainly wouldn't surprise me to see something come out next week. I think you were at a conference last week or 2 weeks ago where there was information indicated that a major settlement was coming out of a Southern California-based company. Who knows which company that could be? There are a large number of FCPA investigations into companies who did business with Petrobras, into companies who did business with Odebrecht, into companies who did business around the 2014 World Cup, around companies who did business relating to the 2016 Olympics. There are simply a ton and a half of investigations right now, and whether those resolve themselves next week or not, probably at this point is difficult to hazard a guess. But I would say that there are multiple investigations ongoing. And let me just say one more time that if you are a U.S. company and you have done business with Petrobras, you have done business with Braskem, you have done business with Odebrecht, you've done business with the Brazilian government, you helped create or build any facilities for the 2014 World Cup, you helped build any facilities for the 2016 Olympics or engaged in infrastructure construction, you need to investigate everything about those business transactions for yourself now, because this is going to cascade down for years and the government's going to come knocking at some point, and you had better be ready.
Good advice. But I think that gives us the springboard now to do Teva. And my number I have on that is 519 million, and you said that puts them at number 4 on the top 10 list. Basically, their major locus of corruptions were in Ukraine, Mexico, and Russia. And not surprising to see a pharmaceutical company involved in an action like this. Any initial thoughts on the resolution or the amount?
Well, the amount included a profit disgorgement of $236 million, which is the second largest profit disgorgement ever. Teva is a Israel-based company. I think this is the first FCPA action for an Israel-based company. Typically in the pharma space, Jay, we have not seen anything close to fines and penalties at this amount. I think Johnson & Johnson was the largest prior, although I may have that wrong. And if it was J&J, I think that was a 71 million. So a huge increase over prior pharmaceutical companies. We have not seen this level of corruption in a pharmaceutical company resolution in quite some time. I think once again, here we had not the systemic intentional bribery and corruption that we saw with Odebrecht, but we had executives overseeing compliance who were unable or unwilling to enforce the company's anti-corruption compliance program. So it's going to be interesting to see how that might play out. We should note also that at least under U.S. law, there's been no individual prosecutions of either employees at Odebrecht, employees at Braskem, or Teva to date. Although at Odebrecht, the aforementioned former CEO has been sentenced to 19 years in jail for violation of the Brazilian law. But back to Teva, interestingly, they also are going to be required to have a monitor, as did Odebrecht. So whereas it did appear that the monitorships were lessening or tapering off somewhat, it may be the opposite now for some of these very large global settlements.
And, I think conceptually it makes sense, just because with the scope of the schemes, I think that, it's good fences and good neighbors that you just can't let them pay a fine and go on. So, there is probably a very good reason to have a monitor there to help inculcate and reestablish, a culture of compliance, which all three of these situations seem to sorely lack.
So quite a holiday week in FCPA enforcement, Jay.
But wait, there's still more. How about 1MDB in Goldman? And there's a Wall Street Journal article a couple days ago, and doing a real deep dive, as the journalist known to do, trying to look at where a lot of this wealth has gone from out of 1MDB. And it focused on one Goldman chief who was head of the Southeast Asia branch, guy named Tim Leissner, I think you say his name. And when you look at the amount of bonds that Goldman sold on behalf of 1MDB to satisfy their capital requirements, they took a real big percentage of those sales and they booked it as profit. And at one point, some of the Goldman execs said, the bond sold so easily, why are you taking such a, huge slice of this? We should be only taking $1 million or $2 million, and they were taking a huge amount of those bonds. And I find this of interest. I'd like your opinion now that in the incoming Trump cabinet, we have 3 former members of Goldman Sachs, if they get approved, and one of them doesn't need to get approved. So Steve Bannon, the special counselor to the president, is there. Steve Mnuchin, and the other person that they're looking at naming is the former president of Goldman Sachs, Gary Cohn. So your thoughts on that?
So there's a couple of different things going on here from my perspective, Jay. The first one is in an article today in the New York Times. It reported that Gary Cohn, the President-elect's top economic advisor and director of the National Economic Council, was involved in the tracking and approving of transactions by Goldman with 1MDB. And that's certainly interesting that you would have the head of Goldman himself actually involved down to that detailed level. And it speaks to the importance of this client to Goldman and the numbers that were bandied about. I think $3 billion in bond offerings with $300 to $600 million in profit to Goldman. So a huge client for the firm, perhaps the largest client over a multi-year period. So we have very high level involvement in this case. But here's the other thing, which as salacious as it may be that the incoming head of the National Economic Council may have been involved in this, is the following, Jay. What's the role of an advisor, or what's the role of you to look at somebody who's your customer? Because at the end of the day, 1MDB was the customer / client of Goldman. So should Goldman have been looking at questions like, where was this money going? Should Goldman have been looking at questions like you raised? Is this too easy? Is our fee too high? That's a level of scrutiny, at least in terms of illegal behavior, that we may not have seen before. Now, we do have one FCPA criminal conviction for conscious indifference. But that's the Frederick Burke case. But what's the responsibility of a financial advisor? What's the responsibility of a law firm? What's the responsibility of a translation company, for that matter, to look at the activities of their client? So that could be a far more or a greater lasting change if somehow Goldman is sanctioned on the civil or criminal side because of the conduct of its client, 1MDB.
Yeah, that's, I mean, when we go back and we look at just what happened with the, what was it? Was it part of the sons and daughters, or which bank wrote a letter of recommendation for one of their clients, but they had not done the proper level of due diligence? Is that J.P. Morgan Chase, or is that another one I'm mixing up?
I think it's J.P. Morgan, but it brings up the point that that's exactly what happened here with Tim Leisner, and why the Singapore Banking Authority is attempting to suspend his license to do business in Singapore, because he wrote a letter on Goldman letterhead vouching for Mr. J. Lowe, who is embroiled in the 1MDB scandal.
Yeah, so I mean, it just, it seems like a similar playbook that we've already seen, and that there was definitely most of these banks wanted to expand within Asia. They saw this as a growth area, and they came up with ways to curry favor with those, sovereign nation funds, and with those investors who had money to spend in IPOs and doing listings and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, not only for the cabinet and this administration, but to see if there's, I know there are a couple bank settlements listed this morning with regard to the toxic mortgages. So I still think there's more to see from the banking sector coming into the new year.
And clearly, we've had requirements for due diligence on sales agents and other representatives on the sales side. We are increasingly seeing due diligence requirements on your supply chain partners. But do you now need to do due diligence on your customers? That's going to open up a very, very broad range of new due diligence requirements. On the other hand, if you want to create a culture of compliance in the business community, it would seem to me that that would be the next logical step. And it's certainly a step for money laundering compliance. So if the U.S. government views money laundering as a component of corruption and terrorism, most particularly, then we could see more due diligence requirements on customers going forward. And this might be, as in the law, Jay, we say bad facts make bad law. Well, the facts of this case might be bad enough that we get a real change in the law out of it.
So I think that's all our FCPA stuff. Do you want to talk about your Cowboys for a little bit?
Yeah, how about them Cowboys? Clinched the number one seed in the NFC last night, not by playing, but by watching. watching the New York Giants lose to the Philadelphia Eagles. So to Dak and Zach, Jerry, Jason, and the whole Cowboy team, congrats. Let's just hope it's for real this year. We got the best backup money can buy right now. Tony Romo sitting on the bench. And maybe we'll see him play a little bit over the next couple of games since they've clinched the number 1 seed now. So it's going to be an interesting set of playoffs. I can't recall a first-year quarterback taking a team to a Super Bowl win. I can't recall a first-year quarterback taking a team to a Super Bowl now that I roll through the last 50. But perhaps there are. But been a long time for the Cowboys. I hope Jerry Jones doesn't screw this up, as is his wont. And we may have a second team in the playoffs from the great state of Texas this year, Jay. And although they're not my number 1 favorites, we have the Houston Texans leading their division. Brought in Tom Savage off the bench at a svelte $600,000 annual salary, taking over for Mr. $72 million, Brock Osweiler. Took us to a victory last week over Jacksonville. Hopefully we can lead us to a victory this week as well. And if the Texans win out, they will win their division. They have the tiebreaker, and it may come down to a final season game, winner take all, with the Tennessee Titans, which would be even more juicy irony since, of course, the Titans were the former Houston Oilers, although I doubt there are any Oilers left on the Titans. But you have the former Houston team playing the current Houston team for a winner-take-all event. So lots of fun in Texas professional football, at least this week.
You still there, Tom? You're kind of bouncing in and out.
Still here.
Okay, so I guess the only thing similar to that with a rookie quarterback leading a team to the Super Bowl, we know of a story of your alumnus Tom Brady, who has a second-year non-starting quarterback, did lead the Patriots to their first Super Bowl victory in 2001. So it could be fun to see the against the old master, Mr. Brady, and that would put you in a very tough rooting position, right?
Final thoughts on this December 23rd?
I just want to thank everyone for spending half your year listening to us and our ramblings and musings about FCPA ethics and compliance in football. I know I enjoy my weekly chats with you, so I thank you for putting this together and giving us a forum to discuss this week in the FCPA. So happy holidays, Tom, to you, Michelle, Paris, and the rest of your family.
Same to Mrs. Translation and the M&M girls.
Thanks. All right, everyone, thank you for joining us. Happy holidays, and we will be back with you in the new year to discuss the FCPA week that was.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you again for listening to This Week in FCPA. I have 2 requests of you. The first is, if you've listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate this podcast, as it would help our rankings. The second thing is, if you'd like any questions answered, please email them to me. We're collecting questions for our mailbag episode. You can reach me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for listening to This Week in FCPA.